Okay, so here we are with Victor.
Hey
Y-
Andrew,
How are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
Thank you for coming along to discuss your book, The Ordeal, which is a history of the Muslim Brotherhood since the 1960s, uh,
1968.
since 1968. Um, So that framing in itself is very interesting. You've chosen to make it from 1968. You've used this title, the Fourth Ordeal, which is interesting too. So if you could just explain where that came from, why that title, what it's referring to, why from 1968, you could just lay out what the thinking was with this framing.
Yes, well, basically, well, thanks again, Andrew. It's really a pleasure to be on your show. And well, the fourth ordeal was what a source of mine mentioned to me shortly after the incidents of Rabaa Adawiya, where you know several hundred of Muslim Brotherhood supporters and members were basically killed. And yeah, this guy, he basically told me that's our fourth ordeal. It's the fourth sort of test that God puts us under in our history. Of course, the three previous ordeals were the first one was in 1949, which is when the Muslim Brotherhood was dissolved by the government at the time. They reconstituted themselves in 1951, and then tried to, get into a deal with the Gamal Abdel Nasser, who took power in 1952, and then in 1954, Nasser cracked down on them again. It was a much bigger ordeal than the first one. Many members, thousands of members, were thrown into prison. Many more went into exile. And then there was an attempt to reconstitute the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1960s around the efforts of Sayyid Qutb, or I should say, under the spiritual leadership of Sayyid Qutb, the
Mm.
famous Islamic ideologue and thinker, intellectual. And yes, and at the time, the Muslim Brotherhood was suppressed again because Nasser's henchmen discovered the ploy, and um, and then the Brotherhood re-emerged in the late 1960s, and particularly after the 1970s when Anwar Sadat came to power. And they sort of grew and grew over the coming 4 or 5 decades until in 2013, when the short-lived experiment in power ended abruptly, and the Muslim Brotherhood were thrown out of office and into prison and went back into exile. And that's really the fourth ordeal in their history.
So they're thinking,
Sorry,
yeah,
sorry
so
to,
go ahead.
to mention the other question of 1968.
Yeah.
1968 was actually because so I could have taken 1967 because obviously of the war of 1967. But 1968 was the first time I discovered the Muslim Brotherhood reappear in the sources. It was also a time when there was a lot of student agitation, and the students were starting to protest against Nasser, and against, not directly against Nasser at that point, but against all kinds of social and economic issues. And one of the famous members of the Muslim Brotherhood, Khairat al-Shatir, was appearing in one of the sources in a protest in Alexandria. And I thought that was a good moment because it's the beginning of the rise of student life at the Egyptian universities, student activism, politicization of students after the Six-Day War. And then, of course, in the 1970s, they're being released out of prison in general amnesty. And then they're reconstituting themselves. But this is why I chose the year 1968 as the beginning of this history. Also, I ended it in 2018, which makes 50 years. So
Yeah. So they're using this word mihna to refer to these ordeals they've had throughout their history. And then you have the ordeal of what they experienced in 2013 and since then. And in between, you have the Said Qutb, the crackdown at the time of Said Qutb, and then you have what they experienced in 2013 and since. And so you're looking at the history of in between these two periods.
so to speak, yeah, so to speak. I'm looking at the history of the reconstitution of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm.
There was a very famous author, or famous historian, Richard Mitchell, who wrote
Yes.
a book. Yes, that's it. The Society of the Muslim Brothers,
Yep.
which is published in 1969.
Yes.
You really get the impression from Mitchell that he sees that as a historical project. He doesn't really expect the Muslim Brotherhood to somehow reappear, a few years later already.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's stunning, really, when looking at his book. It's, as you say, it's absolutely obvious that in 1969, when he wrote it, nobody thought this organization was going anywhere.
Yes.
It was a fringe organization because it was appealing to a politics that was on an ideology that was seen as fringe, wasn't central. I mean, this was the era still of Arab nationalism.
Absolutely.
Secular politics was leftist politics were important.
Yeah.
So as you say, you're laying out the history of their revival as an organization.
Yes, their revival and their subsequent growth, because in the 1970s there is something very interesting that's happening in the 1970s. On the one hand, there is this Islamic awakening, as it's called, that happens at Egyptian universities throughout the country. There is this sort of spontaneous Islamization of society. Women are starting to wear the veil again. There is a segregation of men and women in public life, for example, in school buses or minibuses that drive students to school. So there is this spontaneous Islamization after the collapse of secular Nasserism, as you said. So that's one trend. On the other hand, you have this amnesty of under Anwar al-Sadat, who lets a lot of political prisoners, not only Muslim Brotherhood, but also communists, etc., out of prison. And these two groups are kind of competing in the 1970s. And the Muslim Brotherhood they're trying to take the lead. They're trying to offer to the students who politicize spontaneously on the universities, they try to offer them a solution of how the Islamic revival could be organized and in a way systematized and achieved in a sort of like in a coherent fashion, because they see themselves as already having some sort of blueprint, some sort of organizational foundation, some sort of framework that they can offer to the students. And the students actually, so the 1970s is really like a market of different ideas in this wake of the vacuum of the Nasserist social secular Nasserism. There's this vacuum that's happening, and you have communists and socialists and Trotskyists and Islamists and everybody competing against each other. And there is this clear tendency in the sources, for example, by Abdul Monem Abul Futuh, who wrote a biography in, I think it was 2011 or 12. But there is this clear sense by the Islamist students that they cannot really compete with, for example, with the Marxist students. The Marxists, they come with their ready set frameworks of Marx, class struggle. They have very clear concepts around politics and social and economic issues that the Islamist students simply lack. And so the Brotherhood offered them a sort of a framework that helps them fortifying their arguments towards these other Nasrists and communists and atheist students. And that's the interesting trend that's converging in the 1970s. And then there is a pact that's happening in, I think it's 1974 or 75. There is a pact between the leader of the student unions, which in the student union Cairo University, which is Abdul Monem Abul Futuh, and one of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's being kept secret even in front of the other students, that actually the Jama'a Islamiyya, which is the Islamic student movement is called, that the Jama'a Islamiyya is in a pact now with the Muslim Brotherhood, and that actually they're having become the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's only in the late 1970s that this is becoming public knowledge in the wake of the rapprochement between Egypt and Israel.
Yeah. And after that, under Mubarak, of course, they go from success to success. They become dominant in the syndicates, where they are very active as a kind of replacement for not being able to operate politically, officially, in the political system. It's difficult, but it's easier for them to go through the professional syndicates and engage in their elections. And basically, it's a huge success story, as you show. But somehow, despite the success over a number of decades, they get to 2011. It all looks like it's going fantastic, and yet it all falls apart. They have this 2-year period. They end up coming to power, and it doesn't work out. And there are disastrous decisions that are made. And I think, what you're trying to lay out is why that happened. And what I get from your book, and others have talked about this as well, is that there were really kind of two wings within the movement that had developed since the 1970s. One that was kind of vaguely reformist, and one that was more kind of old guard, old fashioned, and who are somehow seen as responsible for the failures of that period right at the end of the success, 2011 to 2013. Am I right? Is that what's going on here?
Absolutely, that's what's going on. I would just also add that there is a third movement, which I think is developing in the 90s, and the early started in the late 90s, when the internet is becoming a thing. And during the first decade of from 2000 to 2010, this movement is growing, and it is basically the movement of young people, of young Muslim brothers, and these youngsters, they are more integrated with other student movements. So, for example, in the wake of the Iraq War, they coordinate together with secular student movements, and they're less parochial. They're more reaching out to other young people. And there is this whole student protest movement that is gradually developing during that decade, and that is actually then culminating in the Arab uprising of 2011, or the Egyptian uprising of 2011. So that I would add this as a third movement. But of course, these students are also more on the reformist side. They're not on the old guard side. But yes, you're right. There is this sort of division within the Muslim Brotherhood that is then, in the wake of 2011, and especially after 2013, it's basically all breaking apart, and leads to the, not fragmentation, but to the deep splits that the Brotherhood is experiencing today.
And so, in essence, you lay out what the things you think that they did wrong during those 2 years. So, one element of it being that jumped out to me from the book being the fact that from the very beginning of the protest movement, while you had the student activists, as you say, who were very involved and invested in the protests, and wanted to be involved in it, and they were. but they wanted the organization to be involved officially. But the old guard who ran the thing did not want to be involved. And that seems from the beginning of the uprising to kind of set the scene for the disaster that follows, where I don't know, would you say the wrong people were in charge and who made the wrong decisions, and they sidelined the people who may have been able to manage that period in a better way?
Yes, I mean, look, in my view, the Muslim Brotherhood leadership has not really, it tried to steer a middle course between the military on the one hand and the revolution on the other hand.
Yeah.
They clearly came too late to the party, the show had already started a few days ago, and I think it's only in the evening of the 27th of January 2011, in a very dramatic scene where the younger brothers really tried to pull them in and calling them repeatedly, trying to see them and telling them we have to go full force into the revolution. And they took a long time until they really made the decision. And then when they did it half-heartedly. They didn't really go full in. They staged a few protests in front of a few mosques in Cairo and some other cities, but for a few hours, and then went home. So that was not also what the young brothers expected, because the young brothers were basically revolutionaries together with the revolutionaries of other political leanings. And so, yes, the Brotherhood had a long period, and then also on February 11, after Mubarak had fallen, there were a core of revolutionaries. They wanted the revolution to continue. They wanted to press on. They wanted the people to stay in the streets, etc. And the Brotherhood basically withdraw their people and then started negotiations. And they actually started negotiations already in the middle of the revolution. I think it was February 1 when they already started negotiating with Omar Suleiman, who was the security chief at the time. So you see, they really try to play a double game. They try to pretend, they try to wear the mantle of the revolution, but as a matter of fact, they were more interested in getting into power as quickly as possible, and not provoking the military too much. And that was, I think, their mistake.
So if that's the case, what is it that they did wrong to fall on the bad side of the military so badly when they had that year in power? Did they misread the military's intentions from the beginning? Did they make mistakes during that year, and they could have pulled the military along with them? Or was it always written in the sand, as it were, that the military were intending to kind of do them over and shunt them aside? How did that transpire?
I've heard people told me, different people told me from different sources, but there is no way to know precise. But people told me that the military knew from the beginning, this is going to last for 1 year, and then we're going to take over again. Then the revolutionary power will have dissipated, but we don't know whether that's actually true. I think if there was a mistake in that revolution, is that the revolutionaries went to ransack the NDP party building of Mubarak's party instead of heading towards the Minister of Interior. I mean, we're here doing virtual history or what if history, but an interesting question I find is to ask, what if the protesters on the 28th of January, instead of going to the NDP, National Democratic Party building, and ransack this, what if they would have headed towards the Ministry of Interior? What would have happened in that case? Because arguably the Ministry of Interior was not guarded very well at that point, because the police was all over the place. So that's a question for speculation, but it's interesting to ask what would have happened. if they would have, gotten their hands on all these files. Then another point that didn't work with that revolution was that there was no revolutionary leader. There was nobody in place who could take over, like Khomeini at the time. El Baradei didn't have the I guess the charisma, or he also was absent from Egypt for a long time. The Viennese bureaucrat, so he didn't really have the revolutionary credentials either. So there was nobody around to take over. With respect to the Muslim Brotherhood, I personally think they made many mistakes. I mean, of course, some people are going to hate me if I say that. So I'm trying to put myself into the middle and say that the Muslim Brotherhood's argument is of course to say that we didn't have a chance. There was a conspiracy from the beginning. The military and the police, etc., they tried to oust us from the beginning. There was a deep state, the so-called deep state, was working against us. So we didn't have a chance. Yes, that is true, perhaps to some extent, that is true, but it doesn't explain, it's not a sufficient explanation why they didn't succeed. Because the reason why they didn't succeed, in my view, has to be found in their own behavior and their own statements. And, they just played it wrong at different instances. I mean, first they said they didn't want to have any power. They wouldn't want to put up a president. And then they came with Kharat al-Shato. And then when this didn't work, they came with Morsi. Previously, they said they said they didn't want to have more than 1/3 in parliament, but when they had a chance, they went full in. So they didn't have much of a credibility. Then they kind of continued the same policies that they had continued before. So the Muslim Brotherhood that was in power in Egypt made different mistakes. And that ultimately led to their ousting.
But what you've done here is specifically you talked, because you were there from 2011, you've talked to a whole lot of people on the ground, right? I mean, your sources are, and this is one of the things that's really stands out with your book, that you've talked to a huge number of people, basically, mainly from if I understood it right, you've got mainly from the rank and file and mid-level, less from the upper echelons. Is that correct? How did you go about your the process of gathering the information for this? What kind of approach did you have?
Yes, I wanted to meet the rank and file members of the Muslim Brotherhood, because we have never heard of them in the literature before. Average, people in Egypt who are members of the Muslim Brotherhood. That was my prime focus. Then throughout the research, I also interviewed people from the middle ranks. I also interviewed people from the leadership. I also interviewed a big group of dissidents, so people who have left the Brotherhood either before or after the uprising of 2011. My approach first was very conventional. I tried to just go via people I knew or I was introduced to, and I tried through these connections to get to members of the Brotherhood. But after a few months, I realized that is inefficient, this approach. And then I just went out into the street. I went to Khan Khalili, wherever. Saida Zainab, just into mosques, and asked around, and I asked, do you know the Muslim Brotherhood? And I'm interested in Islam. I want to know about the Muslim Brotherhood. And at one point, I established a connection, and then I cultivated this connection. And this person then led me to all sorts of other Muslim Brotherhood members. And at one point, I don't know, in early 2013, I was at a stage where I literally would get calls every other day. There is a protest here, there is a wedding there, there is a football soccer game here. So I could basically just it basically just came my way then at that point. But that's why I also was able to have such a good quantity of sources. And the different kinds of sources also allowed me to triangulate the different narratives against each other. So I wouldn't just have the politicized narratives of the leadership, but also the much, more innocent, let's say, narratives of the rank and file member.
So mainly you've talked there about the period 2011 to 2013, but you also, I mean, what's very distinctive with this as well is that you've really looked into the period after the crackdown, after they were shoved out of power. And I think that took you, that took you beyond Egypt. It took you to Istanbul, it took you to London, various places, chasing down a whole different set of sources in a new set of circumstances. So how did that aspect of the research work out?
Well, basically, after after 2013, I left Egypt and went back to write up the thesis. I submitted in 2015 and then had a job. And then finished the manuscript, which was a history of the Brotherhood from 1968 to 2013. I submitted the manuscript to the publisher, and then it came back with the request that I should add another chapter for the period of after 2013.
Yeah.
And so at that stage, I reconnected with a lot of my sources, with a lot of the interlocutors I've had met in Egypt, and that was clear that most of the people were in Istanbul, some were in Qatar, some were in London, but those were basically the three places I focused on, and then I just did another 2 years of research. Several trips to each city, to each location, and basically continued the kind of research that I had done in Egypt. But I didn't want to do any more research in Egypt because, for obvious reasons, it became too dangerous to work on this topic, or any other topic for that matter. And so I compiled more sources and I constructed sort of the last chapter, and I'm really glad that I did it because I think it's the most interesting chapter of the book.
Well, that period, it's there's some really fascinating information that you've managed to extract from your sources that I don't think it's around elsewhere. The fact that even in the situation of the crackdown in Egypt, in 2016, there was an effort by this secret organization, this banned and repressed organization, to hold elections. And 270,000 people inside Egypt agreed to take part in them, whereas 500,000 under the influence of, let's say, the old guard who were in Istanbul decided not to take part. So this involves an incredible amount of communication that's happening in a secret manner in these difficult circumstances. I mean, it's really quite a sort of stunning set of statistics that you come out with. Another thing you mentioned is that those within Egypt had made this kind of this momentous decision to engage in revenge operations of violence from around 2015, which I'm sure they consider to have been a major mistake. So you kind of like lay out this history of what's happened since, and this interplay between the old guard, if we use that phrase, who are abroad in Istanbul, and those inside the country who have become more radical.
I mean, the radicalization of the Brotherhood is a very contentious question, of course. I wouldn't say that the Brotherhood as a whole, did a huge leap in radicalization, but definitely there were fringe elements of the Brotherhood that joined other organizations. I even, what I considered a very well-informed source even told me that a number of Muslim Brotherhoods went to Syria in that time, joined other radical Islamist groups like Al-Nusra, for example, and even Daesh.
Right.
Not sure to what extent that was representative of a broad trend. I think the broader brotherhoods, I mean, there was a moment of agitation, I think. It's likely that some of the commanders of the Brotherhood in Egypt were involved in certain assassinations. But I don't think it represented the Brotherhood broadly, you know. I think the Brotherhood was always throughout its history, and especially at moments like this, was challenged between, you know, more radical elements that wanted to engage in violence and more you know, a broader element of peaceful brothers that wanted to abstain from violence. So I think that happened as well during this period, 2015. So yeah, I wouldn't say that the Brotherhood ever became like a fully fledged terrorist organization of the likes as the Islamic State, for example.
Right, but it's interesting that this term kutubist is used to, I mean, you mention it, but it's used elsewhere in literature to describe the old guard, you know, those who were around in the 1960s and 50s and sort of ran the group as their own kind of like clique, in the hands of them as a clique. They're referred to as Qutbis, but they were the ones, ironically, who were not interested at all in challenging the state. The last thing they would want to do was get involved in violence. The violence came from the younger people, some of those that would be considered reformers. And so there's a sort of irony in the terminology of Qutbis being used to apply to, because people think that Qutbis sort of signifies violence, but those who were interested in that were not the Qutbis, as it were. So this is kind of, you know, sort of
yes,
disconnect with the terminologies in some ways.
I think the Qutbiyin was a sort of derivative term that was made up by the Egyptian media in the 1960s. And then it was used again to describe the old guard.
Maybe to discredit them as well.
To discredit them, absolutely, yeah. Even discredit them. I called them, you know, the vanguard leadership in the book.
Right.
Simply because I think that, you know, a lot of these people identified with the sort of vanguardist element of the Qutbist approach. So sort of the vanguard of Islam, those who have the true belief, those who are truly faithful and steadfast, and that's why I described them as the vanguardists. But the Qutbist terminology, I think, was mostly derivative. I think I used them a few times, but I think I mentioned I mentioned this problematic.
Yeah, but it seems a kind of familiar feature of political movements generally that you have an older a leadership that goes back a long way and who think that they're the ones who must guide the organization, and you have younger people that come along with new ideas, and you have a clash between the two. It seems a kind of a familiar feature. I mean, I can think of the same in many political parties and movements in Egypt and elsewhere. But it sort of brings up the issue of where the organization is going. Ibrahim Munir, who essentially was their leader, old guard person, passed away recently. So where does that leave them now, would you say?
Yes, so Ibrahim Munir was basically the acting general guide. I mean, the general guide is still Mohammed Badia, who is in prison.
Right, he was in prison, yeah.
Still officially the general guide, and that will not change until he passes away. The acting general guide was Ibrahim Munir, but even this was contended because there was the other important figure also in Istanbul currently is Mahmoud Hussein, who was the Secretary General of the Guidance Office, who sort of claimed that he was actually the general guide or the acting general guide, the acting murshid, although he was not nominated by anybody, but he claims that. Roughly around 20% of the organization are siding, and if I say the organization, I mean the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood members outside of Egypt. So of these guys, roughly 20%, I am told, are siding with Mahmoud Hussein. The others were with Ibrahim Munir. There is now a new general guide whose name has been announced recently, but it's too early to know because Ibrahim Munir just passed away a few weeks ago. So it's still too early to know where that leaves the organization. What we know is that the split has sort of improved in the sense that a bigger part of the organization was around Ibrahim Munir, because Ibrahim Munir also did an active approach of reaching out to younger members, of including younger members in a lot of the bodies, the political section. For example, so there is a debate going on at the moment among these younger brothers as well as older brothers on the side of Ibrahim Munir around what's the right approach to do now. What should we do now with going forward?
Yeah, and does in that case does Turkey still feature heavily in their fortunes right now? I mean, that's where many of those figures are based. Is that still going to be the case?
I mean, yeah, they live in Turkey, so I don't think that. I mean, now with the rapprochement between Sisi and Erdogan, he closed a few of the TV channels that were critical of Sisi and the government of Egypt. So he did that. So that was a precondition for Sisi for Turkey and Egypt to rebuild their relations. Yes, I don't think that Egypt currently has a problem with the Brotherhood in Turkey. I mean, there is even some news outlets that wrote about the idea that the release of the Brotherhood had come up, but I doubt that this is true. That it was an agenda point in the negotiate or in the discussion between Sisi and Erdogan. I think that was more on maybe that was brought up on the intelligence level, but I don't think it's a strong point. Erdogan is not pressing Sisi to release Brotherhood members in Egypt. Neither is Sheikh Tamim from Qatar. So yeah, the Brotherhood is waiting for an opening of some sort.
Right. Well, you mentioned as well that that there was this debate in American policy circles after 9/11, since then, last 20 years or so, about whether this organization should be considered a kind of stepping stone towards extremism, or is it a catalyst for democratization, I think is how you mentioned it. How do you think that debate has changed now, given the events of the last 10 years?
The debate, I mean, I think this argument still exists. There are still people who think the Brotherhood is, a dangerous organization.
I see it cited a lot in American political debate and media. It's quite surprising how much it's just sort of thrown out there as a name representative of something completely nefarious in the Islamic sphere, whether it is or it isn't. But the fact that that's happening, I find quite interesting.
it's something that I found fascinating, ever since I touched this topic, was this term, the Muslim Brotherhood. That's just some sort of appeal to people. I don't know
Mm,
what that is exactly. I mean, I'm sure it's part of, wrapped into the whole sort of Orientalist kind of idea. It kind of represents Islam, and it represents a specific politicized form of Islam. And there is no doubt that the Muslim Brotherhood, is being a strongly ideological organization, that there is a danger in this. But that's true of any strongly ideological organization. You know,
mm,
any organization with a strong ideology and a strong corps d'esprit, etc., is a potentially dangerous.
mm,
Yes, on this I agree. Um, but it's also a very weak organization. It's a weakened organization. I mean,
right.
and it's a question. Unfortunately, we don't have these sort of surveys that can answer these questions. But would the Muslim Brotherhood win if there would be free and fair elections in Egypt? I don't know. There are some people, they say yes. There are some people, they say no. There are some people. Well, the first camp, if you take the argument of they would probably win the free and fair democratic election. It's possible. I mean, they did so in 2012. Um,
Even now, after the experience of their year in power, which was disastrous, um,
I
I don't
mean,
know. You think that that's still possible?
it is, I think so. The reason being that the Muslim Brotherhood would have the ability to reorganize fairly quickly. So if they
Mm,
would get out of Egypt and they could be free again, there would be no other party. NDP is dissolved. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi doesn't have a party of his own. It's basically just him.
mm,
But there is no other group in Egypt that could reorganize their ranks as quickly as the Muslim Brotherhood. So yes, from that angle, from the angle of getting out the vote, organizing, campaigning, running elections, etc. Yes, I think I'm fairly confident that the Brotherhood, because they have the system in place,
mm,
have their families are probably still meeting in some form. Um, Probably not very regularly, but those were all people. They all have connections. They kept these connections even after the crackdown. So
mm,
they could, I think, pretty quickly snap back into place and reorganize and then run campaigns and possibly win elections. What other party would win elections otherwise in Egypt? If you ask me in terms of, how many people, how many Egyptians want to have Sharia law, as the governing law of the land, yes, that's a different question. Probably not that many as before, but I don't know that.
mm. Well, I mean, also, it seems to be an organization with kind of tentacles everywhere globally. I mean, it has financial resources that are obviously extensive, but not clear. We don't know exactly where they are. I don't know if they had money in Malaysia, Bahrain. Um, they have individuals who are somehow associated with them, say in America, but that doesn't mean we can necessarily call it Muslim Brotherhood money. But they still seem to be, in other words, a kind of a very, in essence, a strong movement, or like you say, something that can kind of be reactivated when the time comes, as it were, in an effective manner. I mean, that's the impression I have. Does that make sense? I mean, I know that you were reaching out to people, I mean, all over different countries in Europe, in the States, just everywhere, so many people around. This is still a major organization.
Yes, but the Muslim Brotherhood, they have this, they had throughout their history, or at least since the late 1940s, or they have they want to paint themselves as this sort of global organization that
Yeah.
they call it in Arabic, it's called the Tanzim Duwali.
Yeah.
So it basically means an international organization.
Mm,
So they want to give this impression of this globally organized group.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you know, the right wing, conservatives, etc. That they love that because they can point to it and say, see, these guys are globally organized. There is a global effort of infiltrating governments and parliaments and so on, society. I think this global organization is a bit of a red herring. There was never really a strong global organization in the sense of an organization, so meaning something that is actually organized, globally. So I think that's the sort of impression that the media is trying to paint, or parts of the media, I should say. And that is, of course, then taken up by the right wing pundits and so on, like Glenn Beck, for example, or others around Fox News and so on. But yeah, we should be careful with this. I mean, there are brotherhood organizations in different countries. They have different sort of levels of organization, different levels of influence. In some countries, they have a bit more influence, in some others a bit less. But I would sort of question a little bit the narrative of this global movement.
But then isn't there a difference between being an organized movement, like you say, which doesn't exist globally, and having people spread around in many places who can be activated at different points? So whether they're not part of a formal movement, but they are there. They're in many places.
Yes.
It has its supporters in many places, and they have their means to support it in many ways.
Yes, but they're driven by different interests and different goals. I mean, in theory, the Murshid of Egypt, Muhammad Badiya, he is the Murshid of all the Muslim Brotherhoods chapters all over the world. That's just the Egyptian idea. That's just our Egyptian brothers who have this sort of idea of themselves. It doesn't have to do with the questions of Egyptian nationalism. Notion of Dunya, we're the center of the world, but that's just the Egyptian brothers who think that. Other chapters, they're driven by their own nationalist interest, and as I think what is true with pan-Arabism and nationalism, the sort of dichotomy between the pan-Arab goals and objectives and visions, and nationalist objectives, goals, and visions, is also true with pan-Islamism. Pan-Islamism is also more of an idea rather than an actual force. I think the actual force is the organizing framework of the nation state, and that applies as much to the Brotherhood as well as to nationalist and secular parties. That's why all these ideas of pan-Arabism or pan-Islamism never really worked out so far.
Yeah. Right. But you're referring to their, say, sister organizations in other Arab countries, and them not really being, just somehow by name having an association, but not being under their control. Yeah, which is absolutely clear. But still globally, I mean, they have a lot of supporters who spread out. And as a diaspora, I mean, you have a Brotherhood diaspora around the world, right? Well, they has to be, because they had to escape. Many did.
No, that's true. There is a diaspora around the world. I'm just wondering to what extent they could be organized, or to what extent they are organized, and to
I
what
doubt they are. Yeah.
To what extent they can be mobilized, towards a specific goal.
Yeah.
That's sort of like the image that we sometimes get from reading certain news outlets.
Yeah.
They're basically like robots that can be, turned on, and then they're on search and destroy action, and then we're all doomed.
You make this interesting point that overall that there's been kind of too much. I mean, talking about ideology, that there's been too much focus on the movement in ideological terms, and that you study it as just one political movement amongst others. So you're kind of in some ways you're kind of like de-essentializing them as an Islamist organization. You're looking at them as a political movement that rises, falls, makes its mistakes, has its different groups and cliques. And related to that, you also make this point that that it, as an organization, was kind of strangely uninterested in ideology to a large degree. I mean, it has its basic ideology that's been there since Hassan al-Banna's days. But since then, it's not as if it's produced, I mean, you make this point, it's not as if it's an organization that's produced a lot of intellectuals. They really don't want anyone to know about any other intellectual within the movement except Hassan al-Banna, in as much as we can even call him an intellectual. I mean, he was more of an activist and a kind of orator. But beyond him, the Said Qutb and all his books, which are many, but beyond that, it's not an organization that's been interested heavily in ideology in many ways. I mean, you make this point, and it struck me as very true. I thought it was a good point.
Yeah, no, I think yes. I mean, I don't think they're a factory, they're a producing factory of thinkers or great minds, no. Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, no. I was personally more interested in the political history aspect. So my first motivation to study them was to understand who are the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
Who are these guys? Like we're always talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, but I wanted to talk to individuals who are members of the Muslim Brotherhood and just find out, who are you? Why are you part of this club? Like even against all the odds, even at the fact that you're persecuted and so on, what makes you want to stay a member of the Muslim Brotherhood? What's your motivation to this, to be part of it? That was my prime objective. And then my second idea was to write a political history, because I'm interested in political history. I'm also interested in the history of ideas. But in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, I was clearly more interested in the political aspect. And yes, I found that a lot of the literature that is out there on Islamism, political Islam, is always cruising around the ideological part of Islamism, you know, like also the term Islamism in itself is kind of an identification of the ideology of political Islam. And there's been many good books written on this topic, and I just didn't feel I could add anything significant to this. But what I was hoping to add was sort of a political history of the Brotherhood during the last 50 years. And I had the opportunity to do this because I was lucky enough to be at the right time, at the right place, at the right time, and with the right sort of research topic. And the result was that book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's that is what where it contributes, I think, and where it really stands out, because it's not going down that path of constantly talking about ideology and obsessions with various scenarios about what they might want to do,
and frankly,
the future.
It's been rude to say this perhaps, but it's not, as an ideology, it's not that rich.
Right, I mean, exactly.
Ideology is kind of straightforward, it's here you have Islam, you have to make sure that through da'wah and through preaching and proselytizing, you have to make sure that every individual becomes a good Muslim, and then this person will then this good Muslim will then become a good influence on his family, on his surroundings, on his society. Eventually you have whole of society being strong Islamic values, and they will form a government, and these governments will then come together and recreate the sort of the caliphate, or a modern version of the caliphate, more like a United States of Islam, something of that sort. And
That sounds like there is a rather heavy ideology there.
huh?
That does sound like a heavy ideology.
Yes, but it's not a very complex ideology in the sense that,
No. Yeah.
you know, if you take Marxism with the class struggle and revolution, and
Well, the
uh,
fact that they've not written so much on these things means that they can easily argue that that is not. If someone says that's what you want, they can easily say, no, it's not. Where did we write that? Where's our manifesto that says we want to recreate a caliphate? It's not around.
that's true. Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. It's not around then. Yeah.
But so well, where 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 uh where next for them? Uh, so yeah, as you said, Munir has passed on. Badiat's in prison. Um, I mean, you were saying that they'll still be an organization to reckon with, but and which seems correct because all the sort of basics are there. But to actually reactivate them and put everything together is going to be quite the circumstance for that to be possible is difficult to see in the short term, and they're going to have problems themselves putting themselves together when they even have the opportunity. So it still seems a complicated job for them to. Well, I don't know how long it's going to take before we see them as any kind of important force in Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what's happening next. I mean, we cannot dismiss the potential for a new uprising in Egypt.
Mm.
Or I shouldn't say uprising, I should say protests, because I think at the moment there is no way that there is no organized force, or there is no organization in Egypt that could basically lead to a new sort of organized uprising as we have seen in 2011.
Mm.
So it's difficult to see what that the Brotherhood would play any role, significant role in the near future.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure where next. As a historian, that we don't like to answer
Mm.
these questions, but
Yeah.
they're in a waiting position, and they're trying to. I think they moved on from the stage of who was to blame, for the failure, um, but they're not really having a clear plan, it seems to me, of
Mm.
where to go in the future.
Right. So okay. So your book it came out. It's what 2021 it came out,
Yes,
with
21. So yeah,
with Cambridge University Press.
yes, Cambridge University Press.
Yeah. And will it be in paperback anytime?
It is
Uh,
in paperback.
oh, it's already in paperback. Okay,
It is in
great.
paperback. I haven't looked recently, but it's there. You can get it from Amazon.
Okay, well that's great because then it will be at a price people can more afford.
Can afford it's only
Yeah.
$150 instead of 320.
I mean the hardback is always a bit of a shocker when you see the price
It is,
that
yeah.
publishers want to put it at. But of course, they're aiming at these things at not at normal people, or even like normal academics. They're aiming at libraries. They're aiming at institutions, not for human beings. It's for institutions.
They're desperately trying to make a buck,
Yeah.
even
Okay.
publishers.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you very much for discussing that. And we can follow up with this and other stuff in the future. But yeah, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It was a pleasure, and thanks for giving me the opportunity.
No problem. All right. Well, we'll talk
All
again
right.
soon. Thanks. See you.
Bye bye.
Bye.